Nobody anticipated what transpired when a homeless man approached Barron Trump and asked for just $5. A single act of kindness would lead to a national movement, bring a broken family back together, and permanently alter lives. The pulse of the city was unrelenting. The air was filled with the hum of conversations, the honking of cars, and the swerving of walkers. A man sits slouched against the wall of an old convenience store near the intersection of 13 Chicago Avenue and Broad Street in Chicago. He was dressed in layers that did little to block the icy winter wind. A cardboard sign next to him said, "Anything helps. God bless." Although most people didn't care to know it, his name was Michael. He was 50 years old and had been homeless for almost a year after a string of unfortunate events robbed him of all he had previously valued. Every day was a gamble. Occasionally a bystander would throw a few cents in his direction, but more often than not they rushed by, avoiding his gaze. Michael shivered and adjusted his beanie. He saw all kinds of shoes go by him, including polished loafers, sneakers, and high heels. He caught a glimpse of something odd out of the corner of his eye. A few steps from him, a pair of immaculate white sneakers came to a halt. Not only were they pricey, but only a very young and affluent person would don them. Curiosity sparked. Michael looked up. A tall, unflappable youngster stood there. His hands slipped nonchalantly into the pockets of a stylish jacket. Squinting against the brightness, Michael recognized the face but was unable to place it away. Unaware of the attention he was receiving, the boy was waiting in the corner and browsing through his phone. Everyone in the vicinity muttered, and some even covertly took out their phones to take pictures. Michael paused. He didn't usually approach people unless they looked him in the eye, but there was something about the boy's attitude that caught his attention. He wasn't rushing like everyone else. There was a sense of silent observation, a serenity that didn't seem to belong in the midst of the city's turmoil. Michael inhaled deeply before speaking, his voice parched from the cold. He yelled out, "Hey, young man," with a forced smile. "Can you spare a few dollars?" The boy's head tipped slightly as though to make sure he had heard correctly, and he halted in the middle of scrolling. He turned slowly to Michael, his face unreadable. The world appeared to slow down for a brief period. Michael was accustomed to rejection and prepared himself for it. What followed, however, was anything but typical. The boy asked calmly but firmly, "What do you need it for?" Michael was taken by surprise by the question. There was a weight to it, as though the youngster truly wanted to know, yet it wasn't impolite or contemptuous. Michael had not anticipated a conversation, and his throat constricted. There was something unnerving about being asked, but the boy's tone was one of curiosity rather than hostility. "Well," he said, rubbing his hands together for warmth, "a cup of coffee would be nice. Maybe a burger if I'm lucky." Now that his phone was out of his pocket, the boy took a step closer. Michael saw that people were staring at him and silently judging him, wondering why a boy like him would spend his time on a man like him. The boy's eyes held Michael in place as he tried to pull away to avoid the humiliation. The boy said, "What's your name?" His reply, "Michael," was hardly audible above a whisper. The boy gave a small nod, his brow furrowing as though he were thinking about something that was far away. "I'm Barron," was all he said. His introduction was characterized by an unexpected genuineness, rather than conceit or a sense of self-importance. The city's hum returned, yet there was a difference in that exchange. There was a charge in the air between them, like though this fleeting moment might give way to something much bigger. Unsure of how to react, Michael squirmed uncomfortably on the chilly pavement. He had never experienced anything like Barron's presence. Without a single remark, the majority of people turned away from him, avoided eye contact, or threw loose change in his direction. However, this young man was speaking to him as though he were an equal, not merely stopping. Barron lowered himself to eye level with Michael. No one had ever done that before, so Michael was taken aback by the move. With a calm yet clear tone, Barron inquired, "How long have you been out here?" Michael was hesitant because he wasn't used to telling his experience. People were only interested in the sight of his tragedy, not the reason. However, Barron's manner was disarming in some way. "Almost a year now," acknowledged Michael. He hesitated, swallowing the knot in his throat, and said, "I lost my job after the plant shut down. Then my health took a turn. Couldn't keep up with rent. It's been downhill ever since. Barron's eyes narrowed slightly as he listened, not out of judgment, but rather concentration. Michael was unfamiliar with the face, which was a mixture of interest and worry, as though the adolescent was mentally assembling a jigsaw. Michael became aware of the building tension in the surrounding audience. People were observing, chatting, and even pausing because they were intrigued by the strange sight of the young Trump heir crouching next to a homeless man on the pavement. Barron said, "What about family?" Michael shook his head and his jaw tensed. "Don't have much of that anymore. My folks passed years ago. My brother, well, we haven't talked in ages." He grinned cruelly. "Not much left to lose when you've already lost it all." Barron was silent for a while, as though carefully considering what Michael had said. Then he reached inside his pocket without averting his gaze. Michael's heartbeat sped. He had only requested a few dollars, but Barron's actions gave the impression that he was asking for more. He was carrying a crisp $50 note when his hand came out, not a single bill. Michael blinked in shock at the image. Barron responded, "Here," and held out the bill to him. Michael looked at the cash in disbelief and said, "This should cover more than coffee." He was immobile for a moment. It was the gesture itself, not simply the sum. Michael's voice cracked when he finally managed to ask, "Are you serious? Why would you do that?" Barron gave a small shrug. Michael was rendered dumbfounded by the simplicity of his response. "Because I can." Barron, however, leaned in slightly before he could answer. Then he said, "But listen," his voice becoming softer. "This isn't just about the money. I want you to promise me something." Michael gripped the money as though it may disappear and questioned, "What's that?" Barron's demeanor changed, growing grave. Michael felt a knot form in his throat as he said, "If I help you today, you've got to help yourself tomorrow." "Deal." The words were more forceful than he had anticipated. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, he was being challenged to climb out of the hole he had fallen into, rather than merely given a lifeline. Unable to think of anything to say, Michael nodded. Barron responded, "Good," and got back up. Looking around at the assembling crowd, he maintained his composure despite the attention. Michael's cheeks burned when he saw that people were using their phones to record the exchange. He couldn't decide if he should be embarrassed, grateful, or both. Barron retrieved a pen and a little notepad from his pocket once more and hastily scribbled something down. He gave Michael the torn piece of paper. With his hands shaking a little, Michael unfolded the note and read, "Go to this address tomorrow morning. They'll help you out. Tell them Barron sent you." It was the address of a local resource center and shelter that he had heard about but had never gone to because he was too embarrassed or proud. Barron continued, "I'll make sure they're expecting you," in a resolute tone. As Michael gripped the paper and the cash, the atmosphere seemed to change. It was more than just goodwill. It was hope, a shaky glimmer of light in a long, dark world. Michael understood somehow that this was just the beginning. Michael sat there looking at the note in his hands and the $50 money as though they were strange items. His thoughts were racing, torn between cautious optimism and incredulity. Instead of leaving right away, Barron stood there, observing Michael with a sense of frightening intensity. He was obviously waiting for something, maybe a commitment or an acknowledgement, rather than merely giving out something. Michael's voice was shaky as he cleared his throat. "Why? Why do you care? You don't know me." Barron spoke with a slight tilt of his head and a small smile on his lips. He paused and looked at the gathering that was starting to form before saying, "Because everyone has a story, Michael. Yours just hasn't been told yet. And honestly, if I'm in a position to do something good, why wouldn't I?" Michael was shocked. Over the years, he had heard a lot of meaningless statements, but Barron's tone had a weight that seemed real. He was nevertheless plagued by suspicion. "You don't owe me anything," Michael stated, his tone more intense. "I've been out here long enough to know people don't just stop to help without expecting something in return." Barron lowered himself once more and met Michael's eyes. He pointed at the note in Michael's hand and said, "I don't expect anything, but I do believe that small actions can lead to something bigger." That place, they've got resources, job programs, counseling, whatever you might need. All I'm asking is that you show up. Michael felt a lump in his throat and swallowed hard. He took another look at the letter, which had the address written in neat handwriting. Years of disappointment had hardened him to the idea that this was true. Barron gave a slight smile and shook his head, asking, "And what if I can't do it? What if I screw it up?" "Everyone screws up, Michael. But giving up, that's the only way you lose." Although his remarks were straightforward, Michael was unprepared for the ferocity with which they were delivered. For an instant, the sound of the city appeared to subside, leaving only the teenager's calm certainty in his ears. Phones were now openly aimed toward them, and the mob surrounding them had gotten denser. Someone whispered, "Is that Barron Trump?" Michael looked anxiously at the increasing attention. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and it seemed oppressive to have so many people watching him. In stark contrast to Michael's discomfort, Barron was unconcerned. If anything, he seemed to thrive under the pressure. Barron whispered softly, "Ignore them," as though he could read Michael's thoughts. Michael experienced an odd wave of relief. "This is about you and me right now. No one else matters." He didn't feel invisible for the first time in a long time. He was noticed by someone who actually paid attention. He finally responded, "All right," in a firm voice. A sincere smile appeared on Barron's face as he said, "I'll go. I'll show up." He got up, brushed off his knees, and looked around at the audience. "That's all I wanted to hear. And Michael," he said, raising his voice so that it sounded as though he were speaking to the entire audience, "you have more strength than you realize. Don't forget that." Embarrassed and grateful at the same time, Michael blinked. He was unable to find the right words to communicate what he wanted to say. Rather, he merely nodded while holding the note like a lifeline in his hand. The crowd parted for Barron as he turned to go, their murmurs becoming more intense. Michael saw his figure merge into the crowd as he vanished into the metropolis. Hope, which Michael believed he had lost, flickered for the first time in years. And when he took another look at the note, he understood that this was the first step to taking back his life. Michael was outside the address Barron had given him the following morning. Located in a more sedate area of Cleveland, the Hope Outreach Resource Center was a small brick building with a straightforward sign at the door. A tiny stream of individuals came and went, some with shopping bags, others with the same confused expression as Michael's. As though to remind himself that this was not a dream, he gripped the note tightly in his pocket and traced its edges with his fingertips. He still had the $50 cash securely tucked in his blazer. A part of him wished to save it, to preserve the act of kindness as evidence that yesterday had indeed occurred. The part of him that Barron's comments had evoked, however, murmured that it was about the opportunity to start anew, not simply the money. Michael inhaled deeply before entering. He was instantly struck by the building's warmth, which contrasted sharply with the freezing cold outside. The middle-aged receptionist, who had a warm smile and gentle eyes, looked up from her desk. After hesitating, Michael took out the note and slid it across the bar. "How can I help you today?" he asked. Barron sent me, said I should come here." A knowing smile appeared on her face as her gaze shifted to the page. She rose up, gesturing for him to follow, saying, "Ah, you must be Michael. We've been expecting you. Come on, let's get you started." The hours that followed flew by. A caseworker met with Michael, listened to his tale without passing judgment, and laid out a strategy to help him get back on his feet. They provided him with a makeshift bed at their shelter, scheduled a visit with a doctor to treat his medical conditions, and even put him in touch with a job training program. For the first time in years, Michael felt as though the parts of his life were being painstakingly put back together, even though it was overwhelming. Later that night, while sitting on the edge of his cot in the shelter, Michael mentally relived the previous 24 hours. The stranger's generosity, the offer of assistance, the act of just being noticed. Everything seemed unreal. He reflected on what Barron had said in his pledge to assist himself. For the first time, Michael thought it was conceivable, even if it wouldn't be simple. Barron's act, meanwhile, had started to have far-reaching effects outside the shelter that neither of them could have predicted. Overnight, a bystander shot video of their exchange went viral. With stories hailing the young Trump heir's surprising gesture of kindness, it went viral on social media. In the video, Barron was shown kneeling next to Michael, giving him the cash and saying encouraging words that had touched millions of people. While some referred to it as a PR ploy, others contended that it was an uncommon instance of sincere empathy from a privileged individual. Whatever the arguments, one thing was certain. Something unadulterated and potent had been captured on camera. Motivated by Barron's acts, people from many walks of life started contacting Hope Outreach Resource Center with support and donations. Michael was too preoccupied with the next steps, going to his first counseling session, applying for jobs, and rediscovering his self-belief, to realize that his tale was suddenly the subject of a national discourse. That night, Michael felt as though the burden of the previous year had lessened when he lay down. The young man who had stopped to assist him was creating waves elsewhere, but Michael's main goal was to keep his word and live day by day. By the end of the week, Michael started to observe minor shifts in the world and in himself. Employees at the shelter showed him a level of care he hadn't experienced in years. They encouraged him and reminded him that his journey was far from ended, in addition to providing helpful assistance. Within the shelter community, word of his journey had quietly spread, and others who had been struggling in silence approached him because they were motivated by his determination to take the initial step. One man had patted Michael on the back and remarked, "If you can do it, maybe I can too." Even though it was a simple act, Michael felt a strange sense of pride. But Michael's narrative was no longer silent outside the shelter. In a matter of days, the video of his encounter with Barron Trump had amassed millions of views on social media. The story was taken up by news outlets who examined every aspect. While viewers across posted their opinions online, commentators argued about whether Barron's actions were real or staged. A tweet that said, "Privilege with a purpose." A different user said, "This is how you use it for good." It's sad that kindness like this is so rare. It shocks us. But kudos to Barron for showing us it's possible. When a shelter employee showed Michael the film, he told him about the attention. Michael experienced a weird spectrum of feelings as he watched himself on screen, including thankfulness, shame, and an emotion he couldn't quite put his finger on. He hardly recognized the man on the video, the dejected posture, the sad eyes. It served as a reminder of both how far he had come and possibly how far he could go. Barron, however, said nothing in response to the increasing commotion. He shunned public appearances, declined interviews, and paid no attention to the online commotion. For him, this was about Michael, not about soaking up the compliments. Behind the scenes, Barron subtly made sure the shelter got enough money to grow its services and assist many more individuals, including Michael. A broader movement was spurred by the video. People all throughout the nation started posting their own deeds of kindness and marking them with number pay it and number kindness. The simplicity of Barron's act spurred volunteers to step forward in large numbers, and local groups reported increases in donations. The ripple effect got more intimate for Michael. He was sitting in the common area of the shelter one evening when a man who appeared strangely familiar approached him. With hesitation, the man said, "Michael?" Michael narrowed his eyes, attempting to locate the face. Then it made sense. He said, "James," in a shaky voice. He hadn't spoken to his younger brother in more than 10 years. The weight of years gone hung between the two men as they gazed at one another. "I saw the video," James said as he sat down next to him. Michael fought back tears as he shook his head and said, "I didn't know things had gotten so bad for you. I should have reached out sooner." "It's not your fault. I didn't exactly make it easy for anyone to find me." Michael's shoulder was touched by James. The reunion was bittersweet, serving as a reminder of both what had been lost and what may still be restored. "Well, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." For Michael, it was an additional step in resolving his situation, as well as his connections and sense of self. As the weeks passed, Michael started to view his story as a demonstration of perseverance rather than a tragedy. Even though he still had a long way to go, he came with a fresh sense of purpose because of the generosity of a stranger who had given him hope rather than just money.